There was joy, there was sorrow, there were rocky roads to follow, and dreams for tomorrow when times were unkind. There were moments of glory and thousands of stories always before me. Those were the times. There was fear
in our series Might is Right, we explore a part of Nevada history that's been largely overlooked, the story of organized labor. Earlier episodes focused on the powerful miners' unions on the Comstock in the latter 19th century, which inspired the creation of miners' unions throughout the American West. The dramatic confrontation between radical labor and management in the early 1900s in Goldfield, involving a colorful murder trial and the governor's call for federal troops, and the building of Hoover Dam during the Great Depression, when workers facing terrifying conditions risked their lives to construct this engineering marvel. Now we leap forward in time to the mid-20th century, when organized labor battled anti-union sentiments fostered by a coalition calling itself the Right to Work movement. But the question remains today, whose right to work? To open our story, we turn to longtime Nevada labor leader James Saylor Ryan.
My thoughts first and efforts always were for the people within the state. Have good industrial insurance for the workers, good education for our kids, and in general a good solid state that was good for its people. And with the efforts of organized labor throughout the state, all of these things are possible for all of the people, regardless of your status in life. On the other hand, labor is used to living with broken promises.
To find out what happened, AFL-CIO members gathered at the National Automobile Museum in Reno to hear labor historian Guy Rocha unfold the drama of right to work in Nevada.
Organized labor in the United States wildly celebrated when Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office as president in 1933, after more than 100 years of struggling for legitimacy. The New Deal legislation that followed included the passage of the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, popularly known as the Wagner Act, and it was declared constitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. Labor unions hailed federal support of union recognition and collective bargaining as the dawning of a pro-labor era. Unionization in Nevada and throughout the country experienced a tremendous upsurge from the lean years after World War I. The American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations initiated major organizing drives, pursued collective bargaining, and conducted strikes, notably the Flint Auto Plant sit-down strike in Michigan and the Republic Steel strike in Chicago. However, other unaddressed issues loom large. Lobbyists for the National Association of Manufacturers and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce tried to amend the Wagner Act prior to World War II to prohibit any requirement that a worker be a union member as a condition of employment. Their efforts to outlaw the closed and union shop on the national level failed for the time being. The National War Labor Board, created during World War II, sought harmonious labor management relations. Both sides pledged that there would be no strikes or lockouts, although there were some notable exceptions. The origin of the Right to Work movement was a backlash at the state level against organized labor's success at the federal level. Right to work advocates characterized compulsory union membership as coercive and undemocratic. The term right to work came to signify that workers had a right to work without being compelled by law to join a union. Management portrayed itself as the defender of the downtrodden worker against the oppressive tactics of organized labor. Labor leaders countered that what open shop advocates really wanted was not individual choice on union membership, but unrestricted power over workers. The union movement called right to work the right to starve and considered it union busting. Just the same, labor racketeering convictions and Communist Party influence in some unions hurt the public image of organized labor. Management and the media exploited the public relations problem. From 1938 to 1944, many states passed anti-union legislation restricting strikes and picketing. From 1944 to 1946, 5 states, including Arizona, passed right-to-work legislation prohibiting union security agreements. Meanwhile, a huge post-war strike wave of unprecedented proportions swept the nation with the end of wartime controls. Organized labor, confronting skyrocketing inflation, demanded higher wages, enhanced benefits, and union recognition and security. Democrat Harry Truman, who had assumed the presidency in 1945 upon the death of Franklin Roosevelt, ordered the U.S. military to take over some large-scale business operations such as railroads and coal mines until the strikes were settled. Momentum was building against organized labor. Prominent Hollywood entertainment mogul Cecil B. DeMille, in his U.S. Senate testimony on the Taft-Hartley Act, called for freeing workers from a serfdom unparalleled in American history since the abolition of slavery. DeMille emphasized that unions control the right to work and thereby the right to live. DeMille's scathing testimony and that of others critical of organized labor led to the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act by the Republican-dominated 80th Congress. Although President Truman vetoed the legislation, Congress overrode his veto on June 23, 1947. It would prove to be a watershed moment in American labor history. Congress now declared the closed shop illegal. Furthermore, Section 14B of the Taft-Hartley Act also allowed the states to pass right-to-work laws to prohibit union shop agreements and other forms of union security. 7 more states passed right-to-work laws in 1947. President Truman quipped, "You will find some people saying that they are for the so-called right-to-work law, but they also believe in unions. This is absurd. It's like saying you're for motherhood but against children." Truman vigorously campaigned against the 80th Congress and the Taft-Hartley Act in 1948. On September 22nd, the presidential whistle-stop campaign pulled into the Truckee Meadows. Truman detrained in the railroad town of Sparks and briefly spoke to an enthusiastic audience, many of them members of the Railroad Brotherhoods.
President Truman was considered a friend of labor, and labor strongly supported him. The people were really excited about seeing Harry Truman, the candidate for president, stopping in Reno and taking the time to visit. Labor went all out for Harry Truman.
A motorcade conveyed the president to Reno, where crowds estimated in the thousands lined Virginia Street to greet the chief executive as he passed the Riverside Hotel and stopped across the street from the Washoe County Courthouse at Pounding Park. Truman lambasted the Republican congressional leadership in his public address. "They are a bunch of old mossbacks. They are living in 1890, and they tried to make Congress act as they did back in 1890. These reactionaries decided what Congress should do." The president did not specifically mention the Taft-Hartley Act in his short speech, although he told the crowd that your future industrial and economic progress will be furthered if you select a progressive administration and Congress. He asked voters to elect Walter S. Bering, the Democratic challenger for Nevada's lone seat in the House of Representatives. Bering vowed to support the repeal of the Taft-Hartley law. On November 2nd, Nevada, on the strength of the Clark County vote, helped carry Truman to an upset victory over Thomas E. Dewey in the presidential election. Also elected Bering to Congress in a very close contest. The Democrats also won majorities in both houses of Congress. Organized labor throughout Nevada had enthusiastically supported the Truman candidacy and expected to see the Taft-Hartley Act amended, if not repealed, in the 81st Congress. However, 3 days into 1949, and before President Truman's inauguration, the U.S. Supreme Court set the tone for the debate over the Taft-Hartley Act. Ruling on 3 cases, the court declared that state right-to-work laws, as permitted in Section 14B of the Taft-Hartley, were constitutional. Court challenges by organized labor in the right-to-work states of Arizona, Nebraska, and North Carolina had failed. Republican Washoe County Assemblyman Robert W. Wells apparently thought that the timing was right in Nevada for a right-to-work law. On January 25th, he introduced Assembly Bill 22 in the 1949 legislature in Carson City with language virtually identical to the Arizona right-to-work law. Nevada's southern neighbor, the first right-to-work state in the West, had battled long and hard over the issue. Arizona and Nevada were similar in many ways. Both states had experienced a heritage of labor management conflict in their respective mining industries. Both were experiencing a post-war population boom, and both hoped to attract new industry with right-to-work laws. The 1949 Nevada legislature passed a Freeport tax exemption law where goods in transit were not to be taxed. A consortium of business interests, including the Reno Chamber of Commerce, aimed to minimize union organizing in the new warehousing industry, especially by the Teamsters Union with the right-to-work law. Organized labor in Nevada would have none of it. James G. Saylor Ryan chaired the Assembly Labor Committee. While Assemblyman Wells was able to get the right-to-work bill withdrawn from the Labor Committee by invoking parliamentary procedure and a floor vote, The bill was indefinitely postponed on March 11th by a voice vote on the Assembly floor. Ryan and his labor allies had won the first right-to-work battle in Nevada, but the war had just begun. In fact, the right-to-work war was already being fought in the Nevada courts. On September 9, 1948, White Cross Drug Company and Save Right drugstores in Las Vegas had filed a complaint against the culinary workers and retail clerks unions in district court. The drugstores alleged that the unions had demanded recognition as bargaining representatives and were insisting that a union contract contain a closed shop provision. The businesses also claimed that the unions did not represent a majority of the workers, that the employees did not wish to join a union, and that the unions established a picket line around the stores. The district judge issued a temporary restraining order against the unions prohibiting further picketing. 2 weeks later, the Culinary Workers Union and 2 picketers were ordered to show cause for contempt of the restraining order. Alan and Vivian Shore had continued to picket the White Cross drugstore and sold copies of the Nevada State Labor News criticizing the drugstore as unfair to organized labor. Culinary Local 226 and the Shores appealed to the Nevada Supreme Court for a writ of prohibition against the contempt charge. Interestingly enough, Robert Wells, who had sponsored the unsuccessful right-to-work bill in the 1949 legislative session, was one of the lawyers representing the respondents. Among the many arguments made in support of the temporary injunction was the claim that a 1911 Nevada law was in effect a right-to-work law, and that the Culinary Union was in violation with its demand for a union security agreement and its picketing of the White Cross drugstore in Las Vegas. The recent U.S. Supreme Court ruling upholding state right-to-work laws was also cited. On June 24, 1949, the Nevada Supreme Court voted 2-1 in support of Culinary Local 226 and the Shores. The majority opinion made it clear that the right-to-work advocates in Nevada could not make an in-run around the state legislature. The court opined, "From our study of the legislative history and the background of the 1911 Act, it is plain to us that this act was enacted to prohibit the yellow dog type of contract and to protect workers from compulsion to join company unions, but that the law does not by its terms outlaw union security agreements obtained through the process of collective bargaining. If the opponents of union security agreements wish to have them declared unlawful, they should address their demands to the legislature for a clear and unmistakable mandate, and not appeal to this court for such declaration under the color of a law that was never intended to fulfill that purpose." It was a slap in the face to the right-to-work proponents. Organized labor had won a second battle. However, the war clouds grew darker. Despite the best efforts of President Truman, the 81st Congress in 1949 refused to repeal or amend the Taft-Hartley Act. Too many of the Democrats were conservatives from the South called Dixiecrats and were overwhelmingly anti-union. Section 14B, permitting states to enact right-to-work laws, remained the law of the land.
Well, we were very disappointed. The feeling was very strong that they'd be repealed if possible from the books. Although the president did his best, but Congress backed away from him, and on the other hand, labor's used to living with broken promises.
The year 1949 proved to be the turning point in Nevada's right-to-work war. A bitter culinary and bartender strike during Reno Rodeo days served as the crucible for Nevada's right-to-work law. The drama began quietly in January when William O. Royalty, an organizer for the Las Vegas Culinary Union, was transferred to Reno. Royalty had been active in the drive to organize drugstores and lunch counters in Las Vegas, including the White Cross and Save Right drugstores. It was hoped that he could increase membership in the Reno area in much the same way as he had in Las Vegas the previous year. He began formal negotiations for new contracts in April and pursued wage increases across the board to address the higher cost of living. However, the major sticking point with the Reno Employers Council would be Royalty's effort to expand the bargaining unit to include all hotel service workers. Reportedly, a majority of Reno's hotel service workers had signed authorization cards with the Culinary Local by June. While discussions had bogged down on wage increases and other benefits, things went from bad to worse when the hotels belonging to the Employers Council pulled out of the negotiations. The hotels were adamantly opposed to expanding the bargaining unit. To make matters worse, the union contracts had expired. Royalty warned the Employers' Council if a general contract agreement could not be reached, the culinary and bartenders locals were prepared to strike during Reno's premier special event, Rodeo Days, scheduled for the July 4th weekend. 90 days of negotiations had resulted in only about 20% of the businesses signing contracts. At a mass meeting at the downtown Labor Temple, some 3/4 of the membership had voted to sanction a strike. The council, on the other hand, charged that Royalty was holding them hostage. A Rodeo Day strike could do irreparable damage to Reno's rodeo event and a growing tourist trade. The battle lines were drawn. The culinary and bartenders unions fired the first shot when it called a strike against the 7-month-old Club Calneva on the night of June 29th. Union workers walked out of the downtown casino. Pickets bearing signs marched in front of the business. The next day, Mayor Francis Smith, with support of the Employers' Council, requested an armistice on a strike until July 6th. Royalty replied with an outright no. He explained that the council had let negotiations drag on for far too long, and according to Reno's Nevada State Journal, the unions must use the Rodeo Week celebration as a lever in order to get what they want. The Club Calneva settled with the Culinary and Bartenders Union only 27 hours after the strike was called. The casino accepted the new wage scales and fringe benefits. The Club Calneva did not have a hotel, and the question of expanding the bargaining unit to hotel service workers did not apply. While the news was heartening, Reno was in turmoil over the prospects of a full-scale strike. A citizens' emergency committee was created at the request of Mayor Smith, and ads were placed in the city's 2 newspapers calling for volunteers to feed the rodeo crowd at Pounding Park if a strike were to shut down most of the cafes and restaurants. The unions countered with ads presenting their side of the dispute and pleading for community support. Strike deadlines were extended during ongoing negotiations. Still deadlocked, Royalty made an arbitration offer to the council on the morning of July 3rd. The headlines of the Nevada State Labor News that afternoon said it all. Strike is on. Bosses will not arbitrate. The unions pulled out of negotiations and set up a picket line throughout Reno, including the El Cortez, Golden, Mapes, and Riverside hotels. The Nevada State Journal noted that 42 restaurants and eating places and 55 bars in Reno and Sparks were struck, leaving 700 members of the bartenders and culinary union workers walking the streets. The Employers' Council painted Royalty as an outsider who had poisoned labor management relations in the area. Meanwhile, the Reno Citizens Committee volunteers served more than 9,000 meals at its open-air restaurant at Pounding Park on July 4th and 5th. Reno rodeo visitors and locals alike partook of the reasonably priced meals. Despite gloomy predictions that a strike would cripple the rodeo event, the July 4th weekend festivities were well attended. Negotiations between bartenders and culinary workers and the Employers' Council resumed by July 5th, but no real headway was made until July 9th, when the 6-day-old strike was ended. Both sides claimed victory. The council conceded to wage increases, enhanced benefits, and other job-related demands. No agreement, however, was reached on unionizing hotel service workers, and any action was postponed. A newly created Reno Hotel Association challenged the efforts of the Culinary Union to expand its membership to hotel service workers. In the end, the bargaining unit was not expanded. During the course of the rodeo strike, the seed for an organized and well-financed right-to-work effort had taken root. The most influential Reno area business and community leaders, including powerful political broker Norman Biltz, had banded together as the Committee of 1,000 to expedite a strike settlement. Chaired by cattleman and former Washoe County Commissioner Howard Doyle, the group transformed itself into the Nevada Citizens Committee by the end of 1949. Its sole objective was to gather enough signatures to qualify an initiative petition supporting a right-to-work law. Extensively advertising the issue in newspapers and on the radio, noting there is no place in Nevada for labor gangsterism, the Citizens Committee collected more than enough signatures to qualify the right-to-work petition in advance of the 1951 legislative session. The language of the proposed right-to-work law was virtually the same as in Arizona. The legislature had 3 choices: enact the petition into law, defeat the proposal and force it onto the ballot at the next general election, or ignore the petition and let the voters decide in November 1952. The battle was on. Sailor Ryan had not run again for his assembly seat. Assemblyman Van Ingelstead of Lincoln County, leader of the pro-labor forces in the legislature, found himself fighting a losing battle. While the legislature chose not to take action on the right-to-work petition, it easily passed Senate Bill 79, which modified the language of the 1911 Yellow Dog Contract Law. The sponsors of the bill had taken the 1949 state Supreme Court ruling to heart and made it unlawful to require an employee to join any union as a condition of employment, not just a company union. The vote on the right-to-work initiative petition would also be a referendum on SB 79. The Nevada Citizens Committee launched a well-orchestrated publicity blitz of the state, including circulating a right-to-work motion picture. The Nevada State Federation of Labor and other labor organizations, not as well organized or financed, focused on getting out the union vote. The 1952 election saw Republican Dwight Eisenhower easily carry Nevada in the presidential contest. Pro-labor Congressman Walter Bering lose his seat in the House in a very close race, and the right-to-work law passed by 50.6% of the Nevada voters. While Clark, Lincoln, Mineral, and White Pine counties had solid majorities against the right-to-work law, the vote in the rest of the state swung the election. Organized labor almost immediately launched a repeal movement and easily collected enough signatures. While organized labor in Nevada had every reason to believe it could overturn the newly enacted right-to-work law with its slim winning margin, events outside Nevada did not bode well. Alabama passed a right-to-work law in 1953, but more importantly, by mid-1954, the AFL and CIO had failed to convince President Eisenhower to support a bill repealing Section 14B of the Taft-Hartley Act. At the state level, the Democratic platform called for a repeal of the right-to-work law. However, Democratic office holders and candidates carefully avoided the issue, except for Sailor Ryan, who was running for lieutenant governor after serving in the 1953 legislature.
In general, the Republicans were more favorable to keep the right to work at Bill Act. Democratic candidates would not associate with anybody that was opposed to the right to work bill. You couldn't get a candidate to speak about it either way. On top of that, over the time, the union members themselves were partially to blame. They were gainfully employed, making a decent, livable wage, and I think organized labor just got a little fat and lazy, lost their punch. So it left labor in a position it was kind of tough to defend itself.
The sudden death in September 1954 of Democratic U.S. Senator Patrick McCarran, a longtime friend to the AFL, did not help the cause. Both sides used every means to further their causes, including the new medium of television. The Nevada Citizens Committee warned of out-of-state labor bosses controlling the Nevada unions. Organized labor accused the Citizens Committee of using an ex-convict to circulate the Right to Starve petition. It also denounced the Citizens Committee for running paid newspaper ads painting a Las Vegas judge as biased and pro-labor. Within labor's ranks, there was disagreement over picketing the Las Vegas businesses of James Cashman, a powerful member of the Citizens Committee. As one Reno Observer noted, logic long ago was thrown out the window in the battle over the right-to-work bill as both sides adopted a strategy of confusion. Perhaps the most puzzling aspect of the election was the fact that one voted yes to repeal the law and no to keep it on the books. The no vote carried the day in November 1954, this time by a winning margin of 51.3%. Only Clark, Mineral, and White Pine counties voted to repeal the right-to-work law. Sailor Ryan was soundly defeated in his bid to be elected lieutenant governor, and Walter Bering lost his race to regain the House seat he had lost in 1952. Undeterred, organized labor in Nevada began circulating two petitions shortly after the balloting. The first would repeal the existing right-to-work statute. The second would amend the state constitution to prevent right-to-work laws. The merging of the AFL-CIO on a national level in 1955 unified the anti-right-to-work effort. A concerted drive to register every union member in the state and get out the vote campaign was part of organized labor's strategy to win in 1956. Just the same, the outcome was another loss, and the losing margins had grown. The effort to repeal Nevada's right-to-work law resulted in a losing margin of 53.9%, and the prohibition of a right-to-work law in the state constitution lost by a margin of 56.9%. Organized labor was prepared again to go to the voters in 1958 to repeal the law, but the question was removed from the ballot when a district judge found insufficient signatures on the initiative petition. Right-to-work advocates succeeded in passing a law in 1958 using the existing initiative petition process whereby any future initiative petition would require getting the necessary signatures in 13 out of Nevada's 17 counties. Sailor Ryan, who had returned to the Assembly in 1957, tried to repeal the right-to-work law in 1959. The bill died following a 2-to-1 floor vote. A similar effort died in the Labor Committee in 1961. In December 1964, Lou Paley, Executive Secretary of the Nevada State AFL-CIO, noted that chances of repealing the Nevada right-to-work law are dim, and unions will now look at the federal government for help. Yet efforts to nullify state right-to-work laws by repealing Section 14B of the Taft-Hartley Act died in 1965 and again in 1966 after passage in the House, but filibustered in the Senate. Not only was organized labor disappointed with the unsuccessful vote to end the filibuster, it also believed that Democratic President Lyndon Johnson, who benefited from union support in the 1964 election, failed to pressure the Senate. 40 years later, the war over right to work continues at the national and state level. There are now 22 states with right to work laws. Despite numerous legislative bills and resolutions pro and con, including an unsuccessful attempt in 1979 to include the right to work law in the state constitution, the Nevada statute has remained the same. In 2003, Nevada's 13 counties rule was declared unconstitutional based on a federal court ruling in the Ninth Circuit Court. Perhaps organized labor will choose to put the right to work issue to a vote before a very different electorate in the 21st century. Some question whether a right to work law has actually hurt Nevada labor unions, particularly unions in southern Nevada. Others point to the relative weakness of organized labor in northern Nevada. Still others concede that repealing the right to work law would be a daunting challenge. However, there seems to be a general consensus in labor circles that the free rider and fair share issues, where unions are required to represent non-union members in a bargaining unit and union members absorb the cost, present an egregious legal inequity with constitutional ramifications and should be addressed. In the end, right to work remains a highly contentious issue in the United States, and Nevada continues as a principal battleground.
Well, in looking back over the past, I would have to say, and I hope so, I'm thinking right, that organized labor will continue and be successful in spite of the right to work bill. However, as we continue to grow and the influx of people, new employees, other things are going to affect unions to the extent that they're really going to have to be on their toes to protect what they have gained over the years. And I think organized labor, with the proper preparation, will make another attempt to repeal the Right to Work Act in Nevada.
When the smoke of change was rising, you pondered with your pen. Are there new horizons? Are they old with a different name? And the answers to your questions still knock upon our door. Are the strong still richer? And are the weak still poor? There was joy, there was sorrow, there were rocky roads to follow, and dreams for tomorrow when times were unkind. There were moments of glory and thousands of stories always before me. Those were times.